just something in my mind freezes up from time to time. Welcome to Module 8, Lecture 21. This lecture is going to focus on international development. So first off, we should define what we mean when we say development. So on the one hand, there's traditional economic development, right? And that's the combined processes of capital accumulation, rising per capita incomes, falling birth rates, increasing skills in the population, new technological styles being adopted, and other kinds of social and economic changes. So it's a whole kind of cornucopia of different things that gets brought under the fold of economic development. To add a little wrinkle to this, Amartya Sen has talked about interrelated freedoms that may give us a better purchase on what we mean when we say development. So it could mean political freedoms and transparency in relations between people. It could mean the freedom of opportunity, including freedom to access credit, which provides more opportunities for people to pursue their entrepreneurial paths. It could be economic protection from abject poverty, including through income supplements and unemployment relief. So in the event that someone loses their job or is having a difficult time getting a job in the first place, there's enough of a social safety net in place to allow them to not drop into the doldrums of extreme poverty. But there's another concept that has been talked about in international discourse for the past 3 decades, and that is sustainable development. And the definition that I'm going to show you was created in 1987 with the Brundtland Commission's report, Our Common Future. And so sustainable development refers to development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And the idea behind this was that unchecked economic development was having disastrous consequences when those kinds of countries failed to consider what the environmental, political, economic, and social outputs of rapid economic development were. So sustainable development comes along as this idea that if we can tether our current ability to develop economically to what we would want our children to be able to experience, then that will make it less likely that we will overexploit and abuse our resources to the point where people in the future won't be able to enjoy them. So if we want to measure development, and there's a lot of debate about this, there are several different metrics that are commonly used. We're going to talk about 3 of them. The first is, as we've mentioned eons ago at this point, GDP, or gross domestic product per capita, right? And that's a measure on an individual basis within society about the economic productivity. So we showed this map several lectures ago, and it just shows you that there's a variation across the world in GDP per capita, and the wealthiest places, which you might suspect, are those that are in the Western world, like Europe, Australia, the United States, Canada, and so forth. But there's another way of measuring development that has gained popularity in recent years, and that's called the Human Development Index, which is essentially think of it as a basket of different conditions, which include things like gross national income, life expectancy, and the number of years of schooling that people in a country attain. And so here's a map of how that looks using the 2014 Human Development Report. And it's very similar in some ways. You can see that the Western world tends to be better off in terms of its human development, but we get some more interesting fine-grained results when we examine other parts of the world that we saw from the previous map. And so you can see that there's a lot of variation, but you've got places like Argentina and Russia that tend to be a little bit better off, and then not surprisingly, sub-Saharan Africa and parts of South Asia are among the lowest in terms of the human development scores that they earn. Now, a final one which I'm going to mention but is not very commonly used yet is called gross national happiness. And it was developed in 1972 in the Kingdom of Bhutan, and it was an attempt to push back against this idea that we can measure everything about a country's development by looking at its GDP or GDP per capita. And so gross national happiness looks at the overall well-being of citizens within a country. Because one thing that GDP per capita or even the Human Development Index kind of ignore is what are the lives of the people within these countries like? You may have, for example, not as many years of schooling, but maybe the people don't feel as much pressure to perform, and so they have less anxiety, less depression, which could have a whole host of consequences for someone's health. And so even if they're not going through college, maybe they're happier. And so it really asks this important question about what are we talking about when we are trying to understand development? Is it about the wealth of a country? Is it about the well-being of the people in that country? Another problem that has emerged in a discussion of why we see the Human Development Index as a replacement or potential replacement for something like GDP per capita is that GDP per capita and GDP have been criticized for not fully capturing all economic activity that would be deemed relevant in order to understand the wealth of a country. Because in many parts of the world, especially developing countries, there are lots of economic activities that contribute in some way, even indirectly, to economic growth and vitality that are not going to be captured in a survey. So in many places in the developing world, for instance, there are lots of women who perform services in the house, or there are people who sell things on the black market just to get by. Those are not going to get officially recorded in GDP per capita data. So we're missing out on some inputs to the economy that tell a different kind of more holistic story about the total sense of economic productivity and growth in a country. So in some parts of the world that have, in which women have more traditional roles and stay in the household, they're basically excluded from calculations of GDP per capita. So the Human Development Index was a move to kind of understand from a slightly different perspective more about what we mean when we say development. And then gross national happiness is even a completely different approach which focuses on the well-being of individuals and not necessarily economic wealth in the financial sense. So what about some success stories, countries that have been able to make that transition from a developing country to maybe a middle income or even developed country? So the first group that are often cited are called newly industrializing countries, or NICs. And these are late industrializing, semi-periphery, advanced developing states. So in the 1970s and 1980s, these were the four dragons or the four tigers: Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and Taiwan. And so I'm going to show you a couple pictures I have taken from my travels when I was working on my dissertation that show you what a newly industrializing country can look like in today's time. So this picture and the next picture are from Hong Kong, right? And this is considered to still be sort of an advanced, right, industrializing country, but it looks like it could potentially be quite a developed country depending on what you compare it to. And here's another one of my favorite pictures. This is from the cloud forest in the Gardens by the Bay in Singapore. And it's this lush, obviously very beautiful scenery across from the Marina Bay Sands Hotel, which is a very famous hotel in Singapore. And, does this look like the image of a developing country? Are there developed countries that even maybe don't look this beautiful? I mean, so when we think about what we mean by development, we have to consider more than just maybe a number, but also things like infrastructure, tourism, all these kinds of things. Like, there's lots of different ways that you can describe the development status of a country. In the 2000s, a new set of NICs came to the forefront, and those included South Africa, Mexico, Brazil, China, India, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand, and Turkey. What these countries tend to have in common is that they switched from a society or an economy based on agriculture to light manufacturing, and this enabled them to achieve impressive economic growth, especially in a relatively short period of time. So now let's talk about one of these countries in particular, and that is certainly one that is on the radar of lots of people in international relations, and that's China. So let's talk a little bit about China's emergence. So Chinese economic policy from just after the World War II up through the 1960s was based on national self-sufficiency and communist ideology. National self-sufficiency, right, is that word autarky, which we talked about from a previous lecture, where a country tries to produce and consume everything and doesn't need any other countries, right? But after 1976, there was this great opening. Deng Xiaoping instituted economic reforms by establishing capitalist, what he called free economic zones that were open to foreign investment. So in that sense, they already began to erode this sort of purely communist idea about how to develop their economy. And so we can see the fruits of these changes, right? This is a chart that shows economic growth from 1990 through 2009, and it compares the United States and China. And if you look at the differences, I want to highlight two of them. On the left side of the screen, you'll see GDP per capita, which we talked about a couple slides ago. And the United States has roughly 15 times the GDP per capita, so the amount of economic productivity per person than, say, China does. So there's a huge change there, or difference there. But then look at the right side, and that talks about the economic growth, the change in GDP since 1990 in percent. And you can see that China has gone up over 500% since then, whereas the United States has gone up about 61%. So China has made tremendous gains in a very relatively short period of time, although as of late, there's a lot of talk about China's economy beginning to taper off a bit, in part because global demand for construction services has kind of decreased over the past several years, and that has had a significant impact. Also, China's economy has been struggling with a burgeoning middle class, and also, although it was somewhat insulated from some of the effects of the global recession, it certainly was impacted to a certain degree. So there is basically a discussion about China's economy being perhaps slower than it was, and maybe never going back to the very rapid pace that we have seen it for the past several decades. Another way to look at this is, what is China's share of overall growth of GDP in the entire world? And as you can see, going back again to the 90s, it occupied a very, very small fraction of global GDP growth, 1%, right? But then by 2012, China is roughly 1/5 of all world GDP growth. So again, it's now commanding a very sizable influence on economic growth compared to other countries in the world. But this isn't to say that that rise has occurred without any bumps on the road. There have been class disparities that have emerged, right? From a communist society where allegedly the goal was to create sort of a classless society, you now have the approach taken by the Chinese where some individuals were allowed to become rich, and that has caused a kind of fissure between the lower level classes and the upper classes, especially those with ties to the Communist Party. As any society basically increases in its economic growth, although there's some debate about this in terms of inequality, there are certainly increases in poverty that occur where some are going to be the winners and some are going to be the losers. And so we see this emerge in societies that undergo tremendous economic growth. Along with economic growth comes different outlets that people like to utilize when they have a surplus of resources. So prostitution increases. China has dealt with the issue of inflation, as we talked about from several lectures ago, through reducing the value of their currency, getting added to the basket of currencies that comprise the special drawing rights. So they've at least tackled that issue. Corruption, there's still a lot of discussion about corruption within the Communist Party, about favoritism, nepotism, and how that is going to affect the speed and sustainability of Chinese economic growth. And then also, you've got civil unrest. China, right, famously had this student protest in Tiananmen Square in 1989, and there are annual anniversaries commemorating that date when the people rose up against the Chinese government, and now the Chinese government has to balance or engage in a kind of delicate dance between managing the fact that its economy is slowing and providing people with a better quality of life as their middle class begins to expand. So this will be something to watch in the future, as the government may have to afford greater rights and appear less and less like a true communist regime, but continue to adopt capitalist principles and even some democratic reforms, just so that they don't wind up having a revolution where there's a popular uprising to overthrow the government. So how can we kind of figure out what are the factors, both internal and external to the state, that may affect China's path moving forward? Well, one way that's useful to look at this is through what's called a SWOT analysis, which is something that people in businesses, in nonprofit organizations, in governments, and even individuals use to understand the factors that could affect them and to make strategic decisions about what they can do to avoid problems in the future. So if we look at the internal kinds of issues, right, things that are helpful, you've got a large population, which you can mobilize for economic purposes by putting them to work. You've got still steady economic growth, even if it's slower than it used to be, and a growing middle class, which, while on the one hand could maybe require the government to make some reforms and adjustments so that there isn't a public upheaval, it could mean that they now are able to provide more influence in terms of their purchasing power abroad, and that they can diversify their interests. Then if you go to the other side where the weaknesses are, there's pollution, which the Chinese government has taken steps to address, but is still not at the point at which the Chinese government is going to completely stave off criticism for the relatively unchecked economic growth and its impacts on human health and the environment. Just to give you an example, when I was in China during the summer, before I went to look at the air quality index, which the World Health Organization puts out to explain the differences in different parts of the world and what places might have a better air quality than others. And so an air quality index under 90 is sort of suitable for human existence, and it won't really cause that much harm to individuals. Well, where I was in Xi'an, which is in the northwest of China, the air quality index was 170. And so it's not uncommon at all in China, and in fact other countries as well, to see people who are wearing surgical masks to prevent them from breathing in harmful pollutants that occur in the atmosphere as a result of economic activity. Their levels of energy consumption are still quite high. For a very long period of time, China was building one coal-fired plant a week, although recently they have taken to investing in renewable energy so that they can taper off their energy consumption. At the same time, in a quest for greater access to energy resources, China has gone to places like sub-Saharan Africa and tried to develop more energy resources there by gaining rights to the hydroelectric dams and coal and things like that. And then China continues to repress political speech, which means that the people don't enjoy the same kinds of political freedoms that they do in more democratic societies. And at some point, people could be upset enough to, again, say things against the government that wind up spurring a revolution. So that's something to be looked at as well. In terms of opportunities, China is the world's largest exporter. It's now a member of the World Trade Organization, which is a very prestigious institution. It is a member of the resource-rich Global South and continues to spread its tendrils into other aspects of the developing world to gain access to their resources, which it has been very successful in acquiring. Other threats, external. You've got the internet and social media, which provide information that people maybe in parts of China don't have access to. A couple of interesting points about that. When I was an intern in DC, we had 2 women from China who were part of our internship group with the Washington Center. And both of them said that they had never heard of the Tiananmen Square uprising, which, as I mentioned, happened in 1989, because it's blocked by their government. So if you search for that on the internet there, you won't get anything. In fact, if you try to use Google in China, as I did when I was over there, you just don't know, the website page doesn't load at all. So what a lot of people do in order to circumvent the restrictions on free speech and to gain access to social media is they use what are called VPNs, or virtual private networks, that allow their device, whether it's a mobile device or a laptop or a desktop computer, to pretend like it's operating from a different part of the world so that it gets around what's been called the Great Firewall of China. And then democratization. As the middle class tends to grow, there's going to be more demands for greater political freedoms, more economic opportunities than those that are dictated by the Communist Party. So the government will have to carefully observe what is going on with the middle class, what are the demands that are being placed on their government to provide certain kinds of services, and to be mindful of the fact that they will certainly have to make some kinds of changes to the way that they operate if they want to keep their citizenry placated and not wanting to overthrow their government. So what lessons can we take away from all the developing countries that are discussed in this chapter? Well, as far as international trade policies go, we know that import substitution pretty much doesn't work. It takes a magical set of circumstances which are probably not likely to be replicated in the future in order for this to occur and be useful and to lift a country out of poverty. Import institution is where a country that's currently importing something decides that it's going to replace that by developing it on its own. But the problem, of course, is that this contravenes the idea of comparative advantage, because it means that a country is going to be producing something that they're already not very good in. And sometimes this has been very unsuccessful. A more successful strategy has been to engage in what's called export-led growth. So this is where a country decides that it wants to become very useful to other countries in the international system by producing something in a very niche area. So it makes something like shoes or DVD players, and at a low cost, but maybe decent enough quality that it can export it to the developed world. And by building out its capacity in this one area, that may lead to bleed over effects that positively influence the growth in other industries. So it's about promoting one's products out there in the world so that other countries become more reliant on what you are exporting to them. Another lesson is that it's important to concentrate capital for manufacturing, but this can also have some positive and negative effects as well. So in the positive sense, you're able to, by focusing on developing manufacturing facilities, you can, again, focus more on an export-led model for economic development, and that will make it so that the economy is more sustainable and less likely to be thrown into a tailspin when, say, world commodity prices fluctuate. So if a country is focused on, say, the promotion of its natural resources like bananas, well, if the price of banana happens to go down and the entire economy is based on the price of bananas, then that country is going to be in a really bad position. But if you diversify into different kinds of manufacturing, then it's less likely that you will be affected by these exogenous shocks. On the downside, however, the money that you spend for concentrating your capital to develop your manufacturing sector means that you're not going to use that same money for things like providing a social welfare net or important social services like maybe health and education. But the argument to combat that goes, we should develop economically first. Then when we have enough money built up, we can afford to focus on these other things like schools and roads and houses and hospitals. But this is an ongoing discussion, and countries constantly have to figure out what is the best mix of the way in which they decide to develop and spend the resources or the surplus that they get from their manufacturing. So this is just one example. Women who are in a country in South Asia focused on the textile industry, which is viewed as a positive way to begin one's export-led growth model. Corruption also continues to be really important as a driver of development or lack thereof, because if in a country where a lot of money is being captured by the elites, that money is not being distributed, it's not being used for social good, and it winds up being just in the hands of people, or maybe even in offshore accounts where it never sees the light of day and doesn't positively impact a developing country. So one way of addressing corruption, which some scholars in economics have talked about, is by focusing on policies that enhance transparency within a country. So that might be, for example, having in front of a government building a posting of a budget and exactly where all of that money is going, because countries in the developing world may get financial assistance from other countries, and there's a discussion that needs to be had about, is that money being used appropriately? Is it being used in ways that are going to maximize the impact for the largest number of people and help to raise this country's profile away from a developing country to a developed one? So by making the spending decisions and where the money has come from and where it's going more explicit through transparency, that may help to reduce corruption, because it will show leaders are either doing their job or they're not doing their job, and they are sliding their people throughout that process.